So an overview of Australian visas. Australia is one of the few countries in the world to run a universal visa program. That means that anyone who is not a citizen who enters Australia, including the Queen, needs to get the right visa before they come. Now, there are some limitations to that in the sense that if a person arrives in Australia without a visa seeking protection as a refugee, for example, then they can do so. Okay. Obviously, this is an area that's caused a whole lot of issues, tensions, frictions over the last few years, but essentially anyone coming into Australia needs to obtain a visa. And the way the Australian immigration system works is that that visa should be consistent with your intentions in Australia. So it's not appropriate, for example, to get a visitor visa, which is essentially for tourists and people visiting family to come and do work. Okay. Nor is it appropriate for someone on a, let's say, a student visa to come out and intend to stay permanently with their partner. Okay, so the visa is supposed to align with your intention. And we have two statuses essentially in that universal visa environment. You are either lawful, meaning you hold a valid visa which permits you to be in Australia, or you are unlawful. Unlawful people can include people who've arrived without a visa. They include people who've overstayed their visa. And there are different ways to regularize your status, which is to say to go from someone who has potentially overstayed a visa, they forgot, they didn't leave the country before their visitor visa expired or their student visa expired or whatever visa, they can seek a bridging visa. And then in some circumstances, they can potentially seek another visa while they're in Australia, although quite often they will have to leave. Now, in terms of residency status, we have a few different statuses. You can be a temporary resident. A temporary resident holds a temporary visa and they are permitted to stay until the end of that visa. And typically the end date of a temporary visa is tied to either a fixed date, such as you receive a visitor visa, it's valid for 3 months from the date of entry. You arrive on the 1st of January, you must leave by the 1st of April. Or it's fixed to an event. So some temporary visas, such as the 494, which we'll speak about later, is a long-term work visa, and it will stay in place until 5 years, or you obtain the permanent 191 visa, which is related. So visas aren't necessarily only about fixed dates. Sometimes they are connected to an event. We also have bridging visas. Now, bridging visas in the Australian system are designed to bridge a gap between, say, when you've applied for a visa, you're in Australia, you hold a visitor visa, you apply for a 482 work visa. Even if the visitor visa expires, you will continue to hold a bridging visa through that period until a decision is made on your 482 visa. Now, in many cases, bridging visas are automatic in these sort of circumstances, and that's designed to make things as smooth as possible. But on other occasions, you may need to actively apply for a bridging visa. For example, someone who holds a bridging visa A, which is the standard bridging visa that allows you to remain until a new application is decided, isn't able to leave the country and return. In that situation, they need to apply for what's called a bridging visa B. A bridging visa B allows a person to depart and return to Australia, but you have to consciously apply for a bridging visa B in that situation. We also have permanent residency. This is the right to remain in Australia indefinitely and is often the stage that follows temporary residency if people are seeking to stay long-term in Australia. I won't go much further into that, although there are additional things that we could talk about because it doesn't in fact allow you to travel indefinitely. It allows you to stay in Australia, but not necessarily to travel. And then we have citizenship, which is full membership of the Australian community with the right to vote, access to most or all social security, although there are limitations on that in some circumstances for new migrants, as well as being able to seek an office in the Australian, government, state government, parliament, so forth. So those are the different statuses we have in Australia. Very briefly, since the Hawke era, we have divided our permanent visa program into 3 categories. Skilled, which is the one that most employers will have dealings with during their day-to-day work, although that's not to say you won't come across people who hold partner visas or other other non-skilled visas. But if an employer is seeking to support someone to obtain a visa, a permanent visa, then it will be through that skilled pathway. The family pathway currently makes up about 30% of the visa mix. Each year, the government allocates a certain number of places to skilled family refugee, and at present, it's about 30%. So that has decreased significantly over the last 40 years or so, since the 80s, to become a minority component of the program. And then we have refugee, which makes up a very small percentage of the overall program, probably less than 5%. Okay, so that is maybe 5 to 10%. That is the permanent visa environment. Okay, skilled family refugee. When we look at temporary visas, things aren't as organized or coordinated. We have a whole variety of different temporary visas. Some of them are sort of a collection of visas. So when I say visitor visas, there are a variety of visitor visas, probably 4 or 5 at least, depending on the country you're coming from, depending on whether you're seeking to stay longer term, because, for example, you might be the parent of an Australian citizen, or you need to be supported by your family to make that application because you're deemed high risk. Okay, and the same goes with a lot of the other visas. It's not just one. In many of these cases, there are multiple visas, or they may be visa streams. So, for example, the activity visa, there's only one activity visa, but underneath it, when you look at the next layer down, there are what we call 8 different streams, depending on whether you're an entertainer, a visiting sports person, a visiting actor, and so forth. So there's a large number of visas in Australia, and it's really important to pick the right one based on your purpose. Okay, so we've got just a variety up there that I've selected. So student visas, training visas, graduate visas. We do have temporary family visas. So there are temporary partner visas, temporary parent visas. Special category is the visa that New Zealand citizens hold. And that is actually, in the words of Peter Mayers, who's an academic researcher in this space, indefinitely temporary. So New Zealand citizens who come into Australia, they get that visa, but it is a temporary visa and they need to take additional steps if they ever want to become permanent. We've got our working holiday visa, commonly known as the backpacker visa. We do have temporary protection and refugee visas. And then we've got PALM, which is the Pacific Australia Labour Mobility Scheme, which is a relatively new program aimed at bringing in agricultural workers and other workers to assist Australia, but also benefit our Pacific neighbours through remittances and so forth.